My name is Paul Joyce. I'm the Dean here at Sea Education Association. And I'd like to welcome you again today, but also to the rest of the spring. We are going to continue our lecture series about interesting things we do during our programs from our ships in various places around the world with our students. So this afternoon, I'm really very happy to introduce Dr. Lavender Law. Kara's been a scientist with SEA for, I forget how many years right now, has done many trips with us as chief scientist, has helped develop new programs that have been very successful, I think very great for our students, and has been the first who really took charge of the plastic work and the plastic data sets we've been collecting for many years. So with that, I'd like to introduce Kara and see you all again in a month to hear from Dr. Jeff Shell.
Paul, and I'd also like to welcome you all to SCA this afternoon, and I want to thank you for choosing to spend some of this beautiful sunny day with us to come here and talk about trash, or garbage in the ocean, or as those of us working in the field like to refer to it, marine debris. So marine debris research really lies at the intersection of a number of different fields, including environmental science, polymer chemistry, waste management, marine ecology, and oceanography is my background. And there are important aspects of social science to this topic as well. This aligns really well with our education program at Sea Education Association, where we have a very interdisciplinary program. The topic is also one that's fueled by impassioned ocean conservationists as well as anti-plastic activists. And as such, it receives a whole lot of attention from both the media and the general public. So unfortunately, much of the information that you'll find on the web or in print and in the public conception of the problem in general is frankly just inaccurate. In my work, I found that many academics, even marine scientists, share some of these misconceptions. So the reason for this is not that marine debris or ocean trash is a new contaminant, that it's a new problem, it's not. But in fact, the science, the research behind it is still emerging. So I'm going to turn off these lights so you can see the slides a little bit better. Get my stick. So I'm going to begin by talking about what this environmental problem is not, because I'm sure there are at least some of you in the room who may have heard little to nothing about marine debris, or perhaps you've only heard about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. When you hear that phrase, you often hear phrases like floating landfill, twice the size of Texas, more plastic than plankton. These are typical phrases associated with garbage patches. And you may have seen images like this: piles of trash, huge mounds so thick that you feel like you could walk on them, floating landfills. These images are even used by reputable people, such as Oprah, who says this is the most shocking thing she's ever seen. And these ubiquitous phrases and images perpetuate these common misperceptions of the problem. There is no floating landfill that you can walk on, and in the open ocean there typically aren't even large masses of accumulated trash. Instead, in the part of the ocean referred to as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, and similarly in the North Atlantic, what we typically see from the deck of the ship is something that looks more like this: calm seas, light winds, nothing visible on the horizon but sky, water, and clouds. Sometimes you'll see an object float by, and sometimes it's recognizable, like a boot or a 5-gallon bucket. Other times you'll see things that aren't so recognizable. Perhaps these are some kind of lost fishing buoys or some kind of container. And in rare instances, you might actually be able to determine its origin. So these are all images that were taken on a 2012 research expedition in the North Pacific that we carried out. And these are all suspected items from the Japanese tsunami. So here we have a refrigerator that's been floating, and the folks on board were able to open that drawer, and inside were food packages with presumably Japanese characters on them, and then some more everyday items, large pieces of debris. But these are relatively rare. Instead, most of the debris that is present in these regions of the ocean is typically not visible by eye from the deck of a ship, unless you know what you're looking for, let alone by aircraft or by satellites. And that's because they consist of typically millimeter-sized pieces of plastic that are termed microplastics. Now, of course, even though this is small and it's not highly visible, it is still a contaminant. So let's take a step back and ask, what exactly do we mean by marine debris? Marine debris is defined as any solid man-made material that persists in the marine environment, whether on beaches and shorelines. I have a picture here of famous Camilo Beach in Hawaii that's sort of known as Garbage Beach. It can be in the water column, so here's this microplastic debris in the bucket, or the seafloor. And these are images on the top taken from 1,000 meters depth in the Mediterranean of plastic water bottles. And here we have in water more than 2,000 meters deep under the ice floes in the Arctic, you see what appear to be plastic bags. Marine debris, oh, one more. And in the you never know what you're going to get category, this photo was taken by former SEA scientist Jude Wilbur in 160 meters of water off Rhode Island. It's a Ken doll. So marine debris can be composed of any solid material, including metal, paper, glass, cardboard, fibers, wood, and of course plastic. It's estimated, albeit quite loosely, that about 60 to 80% of marine debris is made of plastic, and most of the studies in the open ocean have focused on debris floating at the sea surface, and most of what you find there is indeed plastic. Likewise, on beaches, during beach surveys and beach cleanups, plastic is typically the most abundant material found. So most of the research in this field is focused on plastic in the marine environment, and that's what I'm going to focus on today. It's important to note that the first scientific reports of plastic debris floating in the ocean were made in the early 70s by some Woodsville scientists and also some in the Pacific in the late 1970s. So this is not a new phenomenon. Plastics first started being manufactured and used heavily in the 50s and 60s. Plastic by design is a very strong and durable material, and as a result, it's persistent in the marine environment. But we really don't know anything about the lifetime of plastic in the ocean. We do know that plastic, when it's exposed to UV radiation, weakens, and the waves and turbulence and other energy in the environment will then take that weakened material and break it down into small pieces. But to the best of our knowledge, plastic, even broken down into microscopic pieces, still remains plastic. It's not degraded on any short time frame. So from this point, what I've done to structure my talk is I've structured it by what I think are the major driving questions in plastic debris research today. So the first big question is, how big is this problem? How much plastic is in the ocean? To estimate the amount of plastic debris in the marine environment, you can imagine taking one of two different approaches. First, you could ask, how much is entering the environment? What is the input of plastic going into the bucket, into the world ocean? The other approach would be to say, let's go directly into the marine environment and measure what we find there. So let's go into the bucket and count plastic pieces. So first, what we're going to do is consider the inputs for the sources of plastic into the ocean. There are a multitude of different pathways for debris in general to enter the marine environment. We can think of first the sources from land. There's litter and waste, whether it's mismanaged waste, as in an open dump, or waste that's just lost throughout the process. And those pieces can enter from beaches. You can imagine the tide carrying waste offshore. It can enter through rivers and waterways, and this is a striking image from the Los Angeles River after a strong storm in California, and you see these booms collecting all this floating debris. It can enter from drainage outflows and runoff from land, and winds can carry debris, also often during the storms. And then there are also catastrophic events, things like the heavy floods or hurricanes or the Japanese tsunami. So you can also have sources of marine debris that originate from the sea. From ships and at-sea platforms, you may have dumping. You can have intentional dumping or accidental dumping. On our ships, you occasionally lose that plastic cup over the side. You may have lost cargo. You can think about those shipping containers. Everybody's probably heard about the rubber duckies that were floating all over the world. Fishing and aquaculture activities. Sometimes that's lost gear. Sometimes that's gear that people are disposing of. Recreational activities, and yes, oceanographic activities. Doing research, we do sometimes put plastic instruments in the ocean. So there are a number of different pathways and sources of debris, but none of these are easily quantified, and they are happening at a global scale. And at this point, I don't think we have the evidence to say even what the top 3 pathways of debris are into the environment. How much debris enters from a tsunami compared to waste coming out of all the world's rivers? Hard to say. So at this point, we really can't estimate how much plastic is in the ocean based on the input rate. So I should say before we go on that there are international regulations that ban dumping of plastic into the ocean. Those have been in place since 1988 when MARPOL Annex 5 was ratified. So it is illegal to dump plastic anywhere in the ocean. But as you can imagine, this is very difficult to enforce. And unintentional losses will still occur. You still lose shipping containers. This doesn't do anything to address the inputs from land, which are likely to be large. And as I mentioned, plastic in the ocean persists for decades to centuries. We don't actually know what the lifetime is. So this continues to be an environmental problem despite intentions of these regulations. Since we can't easily estimate the amount of plastic entering the ocean, we actually turn to environmental observations. And this has been the focus of our work at SEA. So the longest and the most extensive data set on floating debris in the open ocean globally has been collected by the undergraduate students and faculty scientists here at Sea Education Association. So for those of you who are new to SEA, you're not familiar with us. We're the only organization that in the U.S. that offers open ocean sailing and research experience to undergrads aboard a tall sailing ship. And we've run the Sea Semester program for more than 40 years, serving undergraduates from colleges and universities across the United States. And I'm guessing there's probably some of our current students in the room right now. Is that correct? Yes. So I welcome those of you who are familiar with the program to perhaps ask them about their experiences thus far. So the academic programs that we offer integrate marine science, maritime history, literature, and policy, and practical seamanship with deep water oceanographic research. The students come here for 6 weeks typically, carry out coursework in the classroom, and they design their research projects that they're going to carry out at sea aboard our tall ships, where they sail for typically 4 to 6 weeks. We do have students of all majors coming to SEA. We're not just a science-based program, and in fact, over the years, we've evolved new programs targeting science, humanities, and other different specialized topics. So, but all of our programs do have the common theme that the students will go sailing aboard one of our ships in either the Atlantic or in the Pacific. So, on our ships, we've been collecting data on plastic debris during the Sea Semester program since the early 1980s in the North Atlantic and the Caribbean Sea, and since about 2001 in the North and South Pacific Oceans. And former SEA scientist Jude Wilbur, the one who took the photo of the Ken doll, is the one who's credited with beginning this time series. And in fact, he published the first analysis of SEA's plastic debris data in Oceanus magazine, published by GUI in 1987. So measurements of plastic debris are collected on what are typically 4 to 6 week long sea semester cruises on board our sailing oceanographic research vessels. Our original vessel was the Westward, and which sailed in the Atlantic and the Caribbean. And now we have cruises on the Portsmouth Kramer, which sails in the Atlantic and Caribbean, and the Robert C. Siemens, which is pictured here, which sails in the Pacific. The cruise tracks during our sea semester programs are repeated annually, which means that we sample the same part of the ocean year after year, and this allows us to address questions about changes in time. That's my son. He's 6 months old, he doesn't know. So the data I'm going to be presented were collected, as I mentioned, almost exclusively by undergraduate students here in the Sea Semester program under the guidance of faculty scientists and in support of their student research projects. And I think it's really important to point out that I think it's unprecedented, actually, for undergraduates to be primarily responsible for such an important baseline data set, such as this one. In addition to the annual sea semester cruises that have been going on for 40 years, we've also carried out now 2 dedicated research expeditions in what we call the Plastics at Sea program. The first was carried out in the North Atlantic in 2010, and the second was carried out in the North Pacific in 2012. And what I'm showing you here is a snapshot of the homepage of a website that we developed to follow this expedition. You can visit it at the web address down there. So for both of these cruises, research on plastic pollution was the primary objective of the cruise, as opposed to the undergraduate education that is typically our primary objective. And these cruises were crewed by Sea Semester alums who volunteered their time for the expedition. We had an incredible response of people wanting to go out and do this work. For each expedition, we did create a dedicated website like this one that allowed folks to follow the expedition day by day from shore, learning not only about the science that was being conducted, but also about typical shipboard life and the experiences that the people were having out there. We had extensive education and outreach components, and in fact, Pat Keon is over here. She sailed with us, and she did an email exchange with schools around the country. And we also collected a gallery of photos and videos. So I invite you to visit these web pages if you're interested in that work. On the 2010 expedition, we did have videographer Scott Elliott sail with us, and he took a lot of footage together with our alum Ben Shelpepper, and they put together this documentary called Into the Gyre, which has been shown at film festivals around the country. and has won a number of awards. Again, if you're interested, I encourage you to visit the website gyre.com. Okay, so back to the data. How are we measuring plastic pollution on these cruises? Well, on every cruise, we routinely tow a plankton net called a Newstone net that's towed at the sea surface. That's shown right here. It's towed at the air-sea interface to collect biological organisms and anything else that's floating at the sea surface. The net is 1 meter wide by 1/2 meter tall. It has a mesh of about 1/3 of a millimeter, and it's towed for approximately 1 nautical mile at a ship speed of 2 knots. So basically what we're doing is we are filtering a 1 meter wide swath of the sea surface that for 1 nautical mile. And you can think about this as filtering approximately 2,000 bathtubs worth of water, of seawater. Once the net is back aboard, the contents of the net and the collecting jar are poured into a sieve, and this is where the undergraduates come in. They sit down and they literally pick out plastic pieces by hand, count them, and archive them for future research. We then take the number of plastic pieces collected, we divide that by the area sampled in units of kilometers squared, and we report plastic concentration as in units of pieces per kilometer squared. So, as I said earlier, plastic debris is not collecting in an enormous floating mass of identifiable objects, and in fact, the majority of the debris is not even visible by eye from the deck of the ship. What I'm showing you here are typical examples of plastic debris that were collected on our cruises. So this is in a large sieve on the left. This is a petri dish on the right to give you a sense of scale. And these are examples of samples that were collected in areas of high plastic concentration. So what you see is that most of the pieces are millimeter-sized fragments. They tend to be irregularly shaped. They come in various colors. They look weathered, like they've been out there a long time. And they are most of them are fragments of once larger items. Typically, we can't determine their origin, either the type of item that they came from or the geographical origin, what part of the world they came from. The exceptions are things like fishing line, which is pretty easily identifiable, and industrial resin pellets, which you could think of as sort of the raw material of any plastic product. Manufacturers make these resin pellets that then get shipped to converters who make your typical bottles or whatever's being made, whatever product is being made. So these are quite identifiable, but in general, you just see a whole lot of fragments. From some laboratory analysis, we determined that the majority of the plastic pieces that we collect are made of 3 different plastic materials: high-density polyethylene, low-density polyethylene, and polypropylene. Those are your resin codes or recycling codes that you find stamped on all of your common products, 2, 4, and 5. And the reason that we collect these materials is that these are less dense than seawater. That means that they float. This makes sense. We are towing net at the sea surface, so we're collecting a floating material. Some of the common consumer products that are made from these materials include things like milk jugs, grocery bags, bread and produce bags, dairy containers, bottle caps, things that you and I use every day. To give you a sense of the size of these samples, there are 240 pieces of plastic in this petri dish, 240 pieces collected in a single net tow. And when you scale it, that's equivalent to a plastic concentration of about 130,000 pieces per square kilometer. So this actually represents a very large sample, a very high concentration of plastic debris. What you can see, though, is it's not a large volume of plastic. It's not a large mass of plastic. So where do we find these small plastic pieces? What I'm showing you here is a map of the North Atlantic and Caribbean. So here's North America, South America, here's the Caribbean Sea. And this map is showing you all of the data that we collected from 1986 through 2010 on our trips. Each symbol indicates the location of a single net tow, and the color indicates the plastic concentration measured in that tow. So the blues are the lowest concentrations, the warm colors are higher concentrations, and the black stars indicate the highest concentrations that are greater than 200,000 pieces per square kilometer. What you'll notice is that the majority of the tows were collected west of Bermuda. These are along those sea semester cruise tracks. This cruise track right out here was the Plastics at Sea 2010 expedition, that dedicated research cruise. So that sailed east of Bermuda to sort of the middle of the Mid-Atlantic Ocean and then came back. In total, this map represents more than 110,000 individual pieces of plastic that were handpicked from the net tows during this time period. 63% of all of the net tows, all 6,600 net tows, contained plastic. And what you notice is that the highest concentrations, the warm colors and all of the black stars, were collected quite far offshore. This might be surprising given the fact that one of the likely sources is land. You might expect to find high concentrations near population centers near land, but in fact the highest concentrations are far offshore. And the green star that you see way over here is what, to my knowledge, is the largest concentration of plastic debris ever observed. That is a concentration of 26 million pieces per square kilometer, which came from a sample containing more than 23,000 individual pieces of plastic. And there's some folks in the room who are on that cruise. You can talk to them about how miserable that was, trying to get all those pieces out. So this sample was collected more than 2,000 kilometers from Bermuda, which is the nearest land, and more than 3,000 kilometers from the continental U.S. You'll also notice that the highest accumulation of plastic tends to be in this sort of band of latitudes, in the subtropical latitudes. And we refer to this area as the accumulation zone. The Plastics at Sea North Atlantic expedition, that Sawtooth cruise track, aimed to define the eastern edge of this accumulation zone, so we knew that we had high concentrations to Bermuda, but wanted to know what happened as you went further across the Atlantic. And you'll see that we didn't actually find an edge to that accumulation zone. In fact, the highest concentration, some of the highest concentrations we've observed are right here in the middle of the Atlantic. So we have no idea how far across the basin that stretches. So why does the plastic accumulate in this region? And the answer is ocean circulation. So this is actually where my background comes in as a physical oceanographer, somebody who is interested in ocean currents and where the water is going. So what I'm showing you here is a spatially averaged map of that same plastics data set. So we're just averaging over all those dots. And the colors indicate the average concentration. So again, blues are low concentrations, warm shades are high concentrations. And what I've overlaid here is a black contour that sort of looks like some sort of running animal. And this is indicating where the surface currents are 2 centimeters per second. So inside of this animal are currents that are even slower than 2 centimeters per second. And what you're seeing here is an area called the subtropical convergence zone. This is where the ocean currents are essentially flowing together, they're coming together, and they're very slow. So what they do is they act to carry debris to that region and then retain it there over long periods of time. You can think of it sort of as the oceanographic dead end from the ocean currents. So what you see is that the correspondence between the highest concentrations of plastic, these red colors, and these very slow convergent currents is very striking. So once we're explaining why the debris is accumulating in this region, but we're also showing how useful plastic can be as an indicator of where those ocean currents are. So it is important to note that these currents explain why the plastic accumulates in this region, but this figure doesn't say anything about where the plastic came from geographically or the length of time that it's been there. Using this map of average plastic concentration, we were able to integrate, to basically add up the concentration within the contour just above the bottom blue contour. If you add up all the plastic represented in that figure, we get, for the first time, an estimate of the amount of plastic floating in the western North Atlantic, and that number is 1,100 metric tons. So it's important to note that this is actually a lower bound for a number of reasons. First, we're only measuring plastic that's floating at the sea surface. There are plastics that will sink. And we also know that the wind, when it blows on the sea surface, will act to mix that plastic down below the very sea surface where you're sampling. So we know that this is an underestimate for those reasons. We're also, remember, only collecting pieces that are larger than the net mesh of 1/3 of a millimeter. We're also assuming an average mass. So this is a lower bound. There's at a minimum 1,100 metric tons represented by this. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the physics, the wind patterns driving these ocean currents. These patterns that cause the plastic to accumulate in subtropical latitudes of the Atlantic are also at work in other subtropical ocean basins. So what I'm showing you here is a map created by Nikolai Maximenko. He created a numerical model that was based on data from oceanographic drifting buoys, so buoys that are out in the ocean drifting with the surface currents. And what he wanted to know is where the debris would accumulate. If you imagine that you had an ocean that was initially uniformly covered with debris, so you sprinkled plastic all over the world ocean, flip the switch and turn on the ocean currents and ask, where is that debris going to collect? And I actually have a movie of this, so hopefully it will work. Oops, hang on. You can actually watch that. That was Sam. So this is his model when it was initially started. You can see that the ocean, I think the ocean currents had just been turned on. And now just watch to see where that debris tends to accumulate. So you start to see there's a hole being opened here at the equator. Plastic, or the debris is moving away from the equator, and it's tending to collect in these 5 subtropical ocean basins. So I'll let you watch that one more time. And this is over a 10-year period. So his model is running over 10 years. So the real high red concentrations are, red colors are where the concentrations are highest. Okay, so what you can see is there are these 5 accumulation zones. These black lines are sort of highlighting those. They're the North Atlantic, the North Pacific, the South Atlantic, the South Pacific, and the Indian Ocean. And these are all driven by the same ocean physics. But what you can think of this map as representing is basically a hypothesis about the geographic extent of these plastic accumulation zones. So each of these regions must be validated with oceanographic data. Now, in the western North Atlantic, we've overlaid our data set with his model, and it overlaps very nicely, validates it. It's where we expect it to be. I'll talk about the North Pacific in just a second. In the southern hemisphere, we have these 3 subtropical gyres, and in the southern hemisphere, there's just generally a lot fewer data available. At this point, there have been 1 or maybe 2 cruises through each of these regions, and they have confirmed that there is plastic there, but we have no idea. We really know very little about the southern hemisphere compared to the northern hemisphere at this point. So I want to turn to the data collected by SBA in the Pacific Ocean. Similar to the North Atlantic, this is also the largest data set on floating plastic debris in this part of the world. We've collected more than 2,500 observations over the past 11 years. So this is a very similar map to what I showed you for the Atlantic. Here's the US. Each dot indicates a net tow. The color bar is slightly different. The highest values here are more than 500,000 pieces per square kilometer. So I do want to point out one cruise track. I mentioned we had a dedicated research expedition in the North Pacific as well. In 2012, this is the cruise track of that expedition. And the goal of that expedition was really focused on a lot of the ecological impacts of plastic debris. So we tried to go where we thought the plastic would be using what that model that I just showed you. And you can see that we did a pretty good job. Most of these magenta highest value circles are along that cruise track. So that one actually departs from our annually repeated cruise tracks. So similar to the North Atlantic, the highest plastic concentrations, those warm colors, kind of highlighted by this black box, are occurring in the subtropical latitudes, again because of the same physics. We used the data to define an accumulation zone. That's what that black box is. And we found that 95% of the tows conducted in that box contained plastic. And in the entire Pacific data set, 93% of the total plastic pieces that were collected in that region. It's important to note that the value of this, one of the values of this data set is that it also shows you where plastic doesn't accumulate. So in this case, we don't have data as far south in the Atlantic, but in the Pacific, we cross the equator, we see that divergence zone. In the model, this is where you saw debris being carried away to the north and to the south. So whereas in the subtropics, you've got currents that are converging, coming together, in the equatorial region, the currents are doing the opposite and acting to pull debris away. So we see very little, essentially zero plastic in these regions. I should give you some geography here, sorry. Here's San Diego. Here we have Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. We sail down to Tahiti, spend time between Tahiti and Hawaii, and then sail back to the west coast of the US. So our plastic trip, our really good plastic trip, is this trip here, going subtropics from Hawaii back to the west coast. So similar to the Atlantic here, I'm showing that same kind of spatially averaged map of the data as in the previous, of the data shown in the previous figure. And what I've overlaid here are model contours from now 3 different numerical ocean circulation models that predict where floating debris is accumulating. So the light gray dashed line is that model that I showed you a movie of, and then there are 2 others. And I should say that each of these contours is defined by the author of the paper. So they're not directly comparable. In other words, they don't necessarily represent a particular concentration of plastic, but the authors drew those lines and said, this is where the highest concentrations are. So I think it's very remarkable that that the data and these three models all essentially overlap. Remember that ocean currents are driven by winds, and winds can be variable in time. We're sampling over a 10-year period, but really it's all falling in the same place. So on the long term, large scales, we know where plastic is accumulating in the ocean. So from these data, we made a similar estimate of the amount of floating plastic. And in the North Pacific, well, it's actually over the entire domain, but essentially the plastic is all in the subtropical latitudes there. We find that we have, on average, 18,300 metric tons of plastic represented in this figure. So this estimate is more than an order of magnitude larger than our estimate from the North Atlantic. Remember, the North Atlantic was 1,100 metric tons. And the reason for that is twofold. One, the area that we have surveyed and that's encompassed by those high concentrations is twice as large. And then the average value within that high concentration area is also an order of magnitude larger in the Pacific than in the Atlantic. Now, it's important to remember that these estimates I'm giving you only represent estimates over the areas that we have surveyed. So let's go back to our original question. How much plastic is in the ocean? How big is the problem? In no ocean have we been able to determine from field data the full spatial extent or the average concentration of any of these accumulation zones of floating plastic debris. And at this point, floating plastic debris is the thing we know the most about in terms of plastic pollution. There are essentially no data. There are very few data that we've collected, but other than that, no data below the upper tens of meters in the ocean, in the water column. There are some nearshore surveys of the sea floor that have certainly shown accumulations of trash, but there's very little quantitative work done on that. We don't really know how much. And then when you get to the open ocean seafloor, we essentially know nothing. We have a few images like those I showed in the beginning. Trends in beach debris, there are a lot of different beach surveys and ocean and beach monitoring programs. Those trends are highly variable. So it's very difficult to say exactly how much plastic there is in the marine environment. Essentially, we're a long way off from the answer to this question. Okay, so back to the driving questions. Second, is the problem growing in time? Well, as I mentioned earlier, because plastic sources aren't localized and they're not well measured, there's no direct estimate of the amount of plastic entering the ocean. So instead, we look for some kind of proxy. One indicator of the expected trend might be the amount of plastic waste that's generated over time. And in fact, the US EPA does make estimates of this, and they have since 1960. So what I'm showing here is an estimate, the EPA estimates of plastic waste generation in the US and plastic waste discards. So the difference between these two is a recycling rate. You can think of it that way. And what you see is that there's been a very steep increase in the waste generated over time. This is the time frame over which our Atlantic data were collected. And similarly, it's been about a 9% increase annually from 1960 to 2008 of plastic waste, of discarded plastic waste. So again, the discards are waste that's been disposed into landfills or been burned or is dumped or littered. So the plastic discards over our study period have increased by about 143%. And just from that trend alone, we are inferring that the amount of plastic entering the ocean has likely increased over time, over the time period of our study. Now, because the SDA data were collected on annually repeated cruise tracks, we're well poised to address this million-dollar question, is the amount of plastic in the ocean increasing over time as we would expect. What I'm showing here are annually average plastic concentration as a function of year. And in the Atlantic, we have a much longer data set, starting from 1986 through 2010. This is from the North Pacific, and I apologize for the resolution, from 2002 through 2012. So what you can see is that in both oceans, we see a large amount of interannual variability. These bars are going up and down over time. These black lines are the standard error of the average, essentially how robust is representing how robust the average is. But you can see that there's just a lot of up and down in both ocean basins. And in fact, if you fit a trend line to both of these time series, you find that there is no statistically significant trend. Essentially, what that means is that we are seeing steady concentrations of floating plastic debris over time. In the North Pacific, it's a little bit different. You might notice that there are two bars here. The gray bar is the 2012 average, including data from that dedicated research expedition that I told you went to the place where we thought we would find high concentrations of plastic. So in some ways, this serves as kind of a warning. You really have to understand what people are telling you, showing you in their data sets. If we include this year where we went to the place where we know plastic concentrations are really high, you might say, oh my gosh, look at that. We must be using a ton of plastic and dumping it in the ocean in 2012. Well, not really. If you take out that single cruise, you see that the average drops way back down. So this was a surprising result, that we didn't find an increasing trend. And in fact, we got a lot of attention for this result. People said, well, where's all the plastic? We don't know where all the plastic is at this point, but the first warning is that there is a lot of variability in the data. If you go out into those high concentration areas and take one net tow, you may get 23,000 pieces. You could go 20 miles away and get 500 pieces. So from place to place, you see a huge amount of variability, and if you go to the same exact location over time, you're going to see similar variability. So you need a whole lot of data to try to get an answer to this question. We have a whole lot of data. We still don't see a trend, so we have to try to understand why that is. To do that, we need to understand the sources. Have the sources changed over time? Have we gotten really good at recycling over time? Or maybe has Europe gotten better at recycling over time? We're not sure. Alternately, there are mechanisms that might remove that floating plastic from the surface of the ocean. So you can imagine that we know that pretty much any plastic we collect has something growing on it. Even the smallest pieces have a biofilm. Larger pieces will have encrusting organisms or organisms like barnacles and crabs. Those can make that plastic heavier and cause it to sink. We're not going to measure if that happens. We know that the plastic is breaking down into smaller and smaller pieces over time. Some of those pieces are going to be so small that they pass through the net. So there are a number of different explanations that we're pursuing. At this point, we can't fully explain the trend, and this does kind of remain a million-dollar question. I think any scientist who works on marine debris will tell you that they think there's more plastic in the ocean now than there was in 1986, but we can't tell you where it is. So when we didn't observe a change in the concentration of total plastic pieces observed in the record, there was one really interesting and important trend that emerged from the data, and that's in the concentration of those resin pellets, those industrial resin pellets that I mentioned. This is a photo of those pellets, again, the raw material of any plastic product. So on most cruises, the pellets, the raw material, were counted separately from the plastic fragments. Again, they're easy to identify. And up until this point, I've been reporting the total number of fragments plus pellets. If you actually pull out the pellets alone for the cruises in which we counted them separately, and this is for the Atlantic, you look at that annual average versus time, and you see a very clear, very strong, statistically significant decrease of about 91%. We think that this is due to policies put in place voluntarily by the plastics industries in 1991, referred to as the Pellet Retention Environmental Code. It's a commitment to total containment of plastic pellets. This wasn't just out of the goodness of their hearts. There was an EPA study that investigated the sources of pellets to the environment and found that there was all kinds of spillage and leakage that ultimately made these pellets made their way into the waterways and into the ocean. So they instituted this voluntary policy called Operation Clean Sweep. And based on measurements of pellets in the North Atlantic, it appears that these industry efforts to reduce the release of pellets into the environment have been very effective, just by that figure alone. Now, the concentration of pellets was actually only a small fraction of the total amount of plastic debris collected. So it doesn't account for the fact that we don't see a strong increase. But it does suggest that a change in land-based behavior can have a positive impact and a measurable impact on the problem. Okay, so the question that most people want to know about marine debris are what are the impacts of the debris on the marine ecosystem and even on human health. So there are a number of well-known ecological impacts of plastic marine debris, and you're probably familiar with some of these. The first is entanglement. So typically larger marine organisms, things like seals and turtles, marine mammals, get entangled by things like lost fishing gear or packing straps. And when I was growing up, it was always the six-pack rings. You had to make sure you cut up your six-pack rings. So we know that this entanglement is a serious hazard to individuals. What we don't know is what the population level impacts are on any one of these given groups. Ingestion. So plastic debris can be ingested by a wide variety of organisms. The poster child is the albatross. If you want to see some really striking image, go visit chrisjordan.com. He's a photographer that went to Midway Atoll, where there are breeding colonies of albatross. And he just photographed these carcasses as they were, it's probably hard to see, but there are actually identifiable items like a cigarette lighter and a bottle cap, as well as other fragments of plastic inside these dead chicks. So we know that seabirds, fish, this is a fish that we collected on our 2010 expedition, far offshore, it was dissected, and there were something like 47 pieces of plastic in its gut. Here's plastic collected out of beach in Bermuda that had fish bites taken out of it. And then also at SCA, Deb Goodwin, together with Miriam Goldstein, who sailed with us, just published a paper this year, or last year, on barnacle ingestion of plastic. So again, on our ship, we collected barnacle specimens from things like these floating buoys that we picked up, and they found a large number of organisms that have plastic inside them. So we know that the plastic is being ingested by a wide variety of organisms across the marine food web. But what we don't know, well, we do know that there is a risk of physical harm. Some of these organisms are eating a big chunk of plastic that can cause damage, internal damage. We know that they can cause a false sense of satiation, so organisms might be starving. We also know that birds can actually pass a lot of plastic, so they can eat it, their gizzards can grind it up, and it might ultimately pass through. So put that together, what it means is we still don't have a good sense. We know there is certainly a risk. We don't have a sense of what the population level impact is for any given set of organisms. We also know that plastic is a relatively new substrate in the marine environment. So, as I mentioned, any given piece of plastic that we collect typically has colonizing or encrusting macroorganisms if you have a piece that's large enough, like this, what we think is a child's ball, potentially from Japan. If you look at even these small pieces, we have these biofilms that are growing on them. So the fact that this is a floating substrate means that it does have the potential to transport non-native and potentially invasive species great distances across the oceans. And there are documented instances of these non-native species associated with floating debris. What we don't know is the scale of this impact, and we have no sense of the scale relative to other transport mechanisms, things like floating logs and coconuts that have been there for eternity, or things like ballast water, which we know transport invasive species. One subset of the organisms colonizing these substrates are the microorganisms, and there's some new work that was just published by SEA scientists, Eric Zettler and colleagues at PUI and the Marine Biological Labs, showing that the plastic marine debris develops this diverse microbial community that they've dubbed the plastosphere. So the plastosphere is very different from the microbial community that's developing on natural substrates such as the sargassum seaweed in the North Atlantic, and quite different from the communities that are found in seawater. So what you see here are some scanning electron microscopy images of the organisms that are growing on these plastic fragments. And you can see that some of them, like these, look like they're essentially embedded in the plastic. It makes you think that they're somehow burrowing in there, potentially using that carbon in the plastic as a food source, although we are far from knowing if that's true. What they've also been doing is conducting genetic analyses on the microorganisms found on different types of debris and on the organisms in surrounding seawater. And what you see in this Venn diagram is, I'm not a geneticist, you can think of it as sort of species equivalents. What types, characterizing the communities of microorganisms that were living on a piece of polypropylene, a piece of polyethylene, and in seawater. And you can see that there's relatively little overlap between those three. But there are rich communities of organisms in all three of those, in seawater and on the plastic substrates. So that group is funded by National Science Foundation to ask some basic questions. What organisms are members of the plastosphere? Are there pathogenic species that are being transported by this debris that might be a threat? And most importantly, in my mind, what are the microbes doing there? Are they simply taking advantage of this floating island out in the ocean? Are they acting to physically somehow chip away the debris, physically break it down or make it smaller? Or are they actually able to metabolize that carbon, to eat the plastic and use the plastic as an energy source and therefore biodegrade the plastic? And I don't think that we have the answer to that question yet. Okay, the last known ecological impact I'll talk about is related to persistent organic pollutants. So we know that some plastics act as very efficient sponges for hydrophobic, persistent organic pollutants that are already present in the ocean, things like DDT, PCBs, and PAHs. And these are known dangerous compounds, toxic compounds. We also know that there are additives in plastic, like BPA, that are probably released into the marine environment. So we know that the toxins are present on debris, either because they've been sorbed from seawater or they're there from manufacture. As I said earlier, we know that a number of organisms eat this plastic debris, and we also know that animal tissues contain these pollutants. But what we don't know is how much of the pollutants that are on the plastic are actually transferring from that ingested plastic material into the animal tissues. And we don't know if that mechanism is then contributing in any measurable way to bioaccumulation up the food chain that might ultimately impact the human seafood supply. And this is really a very difficult web to untangle. It's unclear if organisms are able to detect the presence of these pollutants that might either attract them or cause them to avoid eating the plastics. We don't know if the transfer of the pollutants is actually highly dependent on the chemistry within the animal's gut, for example. So there's a lot of work going on this piece of the impacts. Okay, given these ecological impacts, how might plastic marine debris impact human health? So the first issue is that of public safety, and the most likely place for any of us to encounter marine debris is on beaches. And so exposure to dangerous or contaminated materials could be a risk. An extreme example, again, from my youth was the medical waste that washed ashore in New York, the beaches of New York and New Jersey. We couldn't go to the beach for a while because there were syringes washing ashore. More current issue is the debris from the Japanese tsunami. So especially on the West Coast, there's been a lot of concern about the impact, first of all, the amount of material, who's going to clean it up, there could be these invasives. There was some initial concern about radioactivity that I think nobody's too worried about anymore. The second risk is that the debris, especially large debris, is a hazard to navigation. And I know from my experience sailing from Hawaii to San Francisco, we have cut many nets off propellers on our ships. And there's a lot of traffic out there. So this is actually a major issue. Another risk is through the contamination of seafood. So as I just mentioned, there's been a lot of concern about these plastics that are sorbing pollutants or that contain pollutants, and about them potentially transferring those pollutants into the food web with ensuing bioaccumulation that could impact humans. But at this stage, I think we have no idea what the scale of that is, if it's even happening. So that's a big question at this point. I also mentioned one of the questions that the plastisphere researchers are studying is whether or not debris is associated with pathogenic organisms, and that some of their analyses have found evidence of a Vibrio species. And Vibrio is a genus that has several members that are both human and animal pathogens, so this is a potential concern. And then finally, I think marine debris is a threat to ocean health. So what we're doing is we're fundamentally changing the composition and potentially the functioning of the marine ecosystem. And so this could bring as yet unknown consequences to humans and to human health. Okay, the last major question I'll talk about is what is the fate of plastic in the marine environment? So as I mentioned earlier, we don't know the lifetime of plastic in the ocean because we know very little about the degradation mechanisms, either what they are and the time frame on which they occur. So what we do know is that most plastic in the ocean begins its journey as a large item, a bag, a bottle, a buoy, a fishing net, fishing line, and that exposure to UV radiation causes photodegradation, which weakens the material, makes it easy for it to fragment into smaller particles. This figure is courtesy of Richard Thompson in the UK. It shows a hypothetical fragmentation model of a plastic bag and a plastic canister that start out as a single item, one fragment, of a relatively small surface area, and then as it breaks down into smaller and smaller pieces, you see the number of fragments increase exponentially, and you also see the exposed surface area to seawater increase until you get down to 20 microns, which are the smallest plastic particles that have been observed in the environment thus far, but presumably are breaking down into nanoscale-sized pieces. Now, as these pieces get smaller, the risk of those pieces increases for two reasons. One, a whole lot more things can eat or breathe or ingest small pieces than large pieces. And secondly, you've increased the surface area, so now you have a lot more area for these plastics to absorb those pollutants and potentially cause a risk to the organisms. So while we don't yet know the time scale or the ultimate fate of plastics in the marine environment, we do hypothesize that the risk of that material increases with age or with exposure as that particle size decreases. So here at Sea Education Association, we have an active research program now that is really going far beyond counting plastics, what we've been doing for decades now. And we're investigating a number of these open questions that I've described to you today. So we have a couple of different projects that are funded by the National Science Foundation. One from chemical oceanography, where we're going to be looking at our archived samples that are housed here. We've been collecting them for about 20, 25 years. We're going to be looking at those physical samples to try to understand the degradation aspects. We're going to look at chemical signatures on the pieces, and then compare those to laboratory weathering experiments and samples that are being put out in the ocean to try to understand the timescale of degradation and how old those pieces that we collected might have, or how long, I should say, those had been in the ocean before we plucked them out. The second grant is the Plastisphere, which I've spoken a bit about here, the Microbial Communities on Plastic Marine Debris, and that's in collaboration with Tracy Mincer-Cooey, Linda Amaral-Zettler at MBL, and Gyre Prosperowski at University of Washington. Then we have two grants that are funded by NOAA's Marine Debris Program. The first is wind mixing and floating plastic debris, so trying to understand the physics of how wind imparting energy on the ocean surface will mix those plastic pieces away from the surface, and how we can estimate how, for a given wind speed and plastic concentration that we measured with our surface net, what does that mean about how much is likely mixed below that we're not measuring directly. So we're trying to get a handle again on how much debris is out there, but looking at the physics of how the wind is mixing the debris below the sea surface. And then we also last year just funded for an experiment to look at selective grazing of plastic debris by zooplankton. And Amy Swia, who's an oceanographer here at SEA, and I are teaming up with Tony Andrade, who's also on the degradation project. He's a polymer scientist from North Carolina, so we're going to be feeding zooplankton little bits of plastic that are either uncontaminated or contaminated with some of those persistent organic pollutants to try to see if they like to eat them or don't like to eat them. And we're not asking so much what's happening to the plankton, but more wondering if they can detect the presence of these pollutants. So finally, as I wrap up here, I hope that I've convinced you that plastic debris is an environmental problem that's warranting concern. And if so, you may be asking, well, how can we solve this problem? So I want to spend a minute discussing two very commonly suggested solutions. First is, well, let's just clean it up. We made this mess, why can't we just go out there and clean it up? If there were large floating islands of trash, it would be relatively easy, although costly, to go clean it up. We could take out some big ships and pluck it out of the water and bring it back or do something with it. But instead, what we're faced with is an ocean with relatively dilute fragments of plastic that are smaller than your pinky fingernail. So even if it were feasible to mow the lawn and tow nets and remove all of those little pieces of plastic from the ocean, what we'd also be doing is removing plankton along with it. And those organisms are the base of the food web. So you could potentially do more harm than good, even if you had the resources to go out and strain the ocean of plastic debris. So we really can't clean it up, despite the efforts of Electrolux, who wants to take out all the plastic floating in the ocean and make vacuum cleaners out of it. If we can't clean it up, well, won't these new biopolymers that we're smart people, we're ingenious, we can solve solutions with technology, won't these prevent the problem from getting worse? So it's actually really important that you understand what some of these materials are. And there are a number of materials that are called bio-based or biomass plastics. What those are plastics. Plastics are typically derived from petroleum or natural gas. The plastics that are bio-based or biomass plastics are plastics in which the carbon originates from biorenewable sources, things like corn. So while these may actually reduce the carbon footprint and the fact that they're renewable resources, the polymer that's constructed is actually chemically identical to the polymer that's constructed from petroleum-based plastics. So therefore, the environmental impact is exactly the same. Some other materials are designed to degrade. That is, break down into smaller fragments and maybe even microscopic residues. But beware, they may claim to be biodegradable, but in order to be truly biodegradable, what that means is that the material has to be metabolized by microorganisms and reduced to the basic building blocks of carbon dioxide, water, and inorganic molecules in a relatively short time period. So these degradable materials are actually potentially worse than anything that is already being made because they're just designed to break into these small pieces even faster than they would otherwise. And again, as I said, the smaller pieces potentially have higher risk to organisms. Then finally, there are other materials such as polylactic acid, which have actually been shown that they're designed to fully biodegrade, but only in very specific environments such as industrial composting facilities. So not only we have no idea what they're going to do in ocean conditions, but an added piece of this is that perhaps you're like me and you find that you have your polylactic acid cup what do you do with that? Do you put it in your regular recycling? Because that will contaminate the recycling supply. Do you put it in your backyard compost? Well, it's not really designed for backyard compost. So in many ways, this kind of just complicates the matter by adding a different type of material that we don't know what to do with. It's unknown whether they'll degrade in the marine environment or how long it will take, if they do. So instead, I think, in my personal opinion, it's not the opinion of my sponsors necessarily, in terms of the marine environment, the only reasonable approach is really control at the source. We are the solution. So I think what we need to do is we need to reduce our consumption of these materials, these plastics, through changes in our consumer habits, and especially in the reduction of things like single-use packaging, water bottles, straws, all things like that. Things that are designed to be used for about 10 seconds and then thrown away. So first we need to reduce our use of these materials, recycle what we reuse what we can, and then recycle is sort of the last piece of that. So as a parting thought, many of you may know that Silent Spring just had a major anniversary, Rachel Carson's book Silent Spring, and in her book she made a point about chemical agents, and this is regarding DDT, but I think it applies to plastic as well. She said that we've created these materials in man's search for a better and easier way of life. And I think that nobody would argue that plastics have many beneficial uses and indeed have improved our lives in many ways. But for some pieces of these, some of the pieces of plastic, I think we need to ask ourselves if, especially these single-use or disposable items that have become an accepted part of our way of life, whether they're really worth the environmental price. So with that, I'd just like to finish by acknowledging my collaborators on this work. This is has been about 5 or 6 or 7 years of work that I'm summarizing here. We've got from SCA, Amelia DeForest, who's now in San Diego working for a company called Mobile. Deb Goodwin, who's on the oceanography faculty. Sky Murray Ferguson, who's been working with us for years and did a lot of that plastic picking and has made a lot of our figures, graphics figures more recently. Gyre Proskorowski's a former SCA oceanographer now at the University of Washington, and Eric Zettler, who's here and our Dean of Institutional Relations and Research. And then at Woods Hole Oceanographic down the road, Chris Reddy and Emily Peacock were involved in the North Atlantic work, as well as Nikolai Maximenko and Jan Hoffler from the University of Hawaii. And then Tobias Kukolko from the University of Delaware, we're working with on that wind mixing project. And of course, we need to acknowledge our funders, National Science Foundation, NOAA, and the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. The Doherty Foundation has supported a lot of our education and outreach efforts, especially related to those dedicated research expeditions, and the American Chemistry Council similarly supported some of our outreach efforts. And then most importantly, the work would not have been possible without the dedication of more than 7,000 SCA students, shipboard crew, and faculty, and the innumerable hours that they spent picking plastic from plankton nets. Thank you. I know I've talked for quite a while, but we can also chat informally for no kind of questions.
A two-part question having to do with the enforcement. You mentioned, of course, that it's illegal to dump either on purpose or accidentally. Do other maritime nations support the same legal restrictions as the United States? And two, who enforces the infractions? I know in this country it's the Coast Guard and EPA. Do you work with any of these agencies who do like forensic stuff? Or?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I probably don't have all the information available to answer that. I believe that most, if not all, of the maritime nations are signatories to Article Annex 5. And it is up to that individual nation to monitor their own waters, so in their own EEZ. So like you said, the U.S. has the Coast Guard. I have no idea what the resources how much of the Coast Guard resources are used, for instance, to police for this. I do know that on our ships, for example, we have to keep detailed garbage logs of what we dump over the side. And we spend a lot of time telling students what is in plastic. Is that dental floss plastic? Yes. Is the Band-Aid? Is this, So we spend a lot of time on that, but I can't tell you what other ships do. That's required, but nobody's out there in the middle of the Atlantic policing that. In terms of forensics, I haven't gotten involved in trying to talk to those agencies. So I can't speak to that directly. Yeah.
The pellet data contains sort of an interesting little nugget of information. 15 years seems to go from what it is to pretty little. That represents sort of the time constant for how long we stop emitting this, 15, 20 years.
Well, that's the question. What's happening to them? So are they, those pellets, we're not counting them in the form of pellet over time. So we don't actually know, does that just mean that that's a time constant for becoming smaller than a part of a millimeter? That's a good question, and you should think about how we can better extract that information to infer some of these questions. Yeah. Yeah.
Kind of going off of that question, do you know the year that pellets began to be produced?
Basically 1950 is kind of the start of mass plastic production. Yeah. So, and was there plastic in the ocean prior to 1970? Probably, but there was some amount of time before people started detecting it. Yeah, in the back.
The pictures that you showed us initially of the larger pieces of garbage collecting, the one that was on Oprah and everything, how did those generate as the popular understanding of garbage in the ocean?
A lot of those images I think are actually real images. They're just not in the middle of the ocean. There are places out there that look like that right off the shore. It's who uses them and how are they perpetuated. We get requests all the time. Can you send us pictures of plastic out of the garbage patches? And we say, yeah, it looks like ocean. We can send you a picture of what it looks like once we take it out of the net. But people go out there and they look for images that strike a chord with people to say this is a problem. So it's a really touchy situation, right? Because we have incredible public awareness of plastic pollution in the ocean compared to many other problems that could potentially be much greater in the ocean. Things like overfishing and ocean acidification. I mean, the public generally, most people that I come across are like, oh, I think I heard about that big garbage patch. So that's a good thing that people know that this is a problem. But if they think that it's a floating island and you tell them it's little bits, they might think they got duped. So it's this delicate balance of sort of saying, it's not what you think it is, but it's still a problem, and let me tell you why. But I think in the beginning, when you try to raise that awareness, you try to use shocking images. That's why these albatross photos are everywhere. Because that's like the dolphin that got stuck in the tuna net, or the turtle with the packing strap around it. I mean, you don't want to see that happening. So I don't know that I don't think it was a deliberate attempt to deceive, but those are sort of the images that exist, and trying to use it to sort of prove a point. Yeah?
What do the sea ships do with the plastic they collect?
We archive it. So Jude Wilbur, he started noticing this was coming up in our nets and said, we should start writing down how much plastic we get on every net, and let's save it. And over time, when I started at SCA over a decade ago, that was just part of the thing, was one of the samples that we always collect and save. So in our basement, we have decades worth of plastic samples. And now that marine debris research is really starting to ramp up. If you look at the number of papers published on this topic over the past 5 years, it's exponential. We're getting a lot of requests of people saying, I really want to study this, this, and this. Can I get some plastic samples? Well, thankfully, now we have some funding to analyze them ourselves. So we can't actually send samples out to people. But for folks who are C-semester students who are coming to our campus now, we're going to make those research projects accessible and allow people to come help us with that work. And I think that we should also be, happy to, and we are happy to serve the larger community by perhaps collecting other dedicated samples for people's projects. So we have a process by which researchers can write a proposal for work they intend to do, and we can collect samples for them.
I'm wondering if you know anything about similar research that's done on the Great Lakes. And the reason I asked is I just read an article that startled me that, maybe I should have known, but I'm not sure they use the word pellets, but something that comes out of cosmetics, actually.
Yeah.
And it's not being found in the Great Lakes. So I'm just wondering what kind of research is being done there, if you know.
Yeah, so there's actually a group called 5 Gyres, which, so Alphaleta Marine Research Foundation is the group that's probably responsible for the public understanding of marine debris, of making this a public topic. A spin-off from their group is 5 Gyres, and their goal was and continues to be to go to all of those 5 subtropical gyre regions to see, is the plastic where we think it is? And they're the ones who've done a few trips through the southern hemisphere gyres. They've also paired up with a woman from SUNY Fredonia, Sam Mason, to go out in the Great Lakes. They've gone out, I think, the past 2 summers. And they've been out on a tall ship and towed nets, and they're finding plastic. And what they found, again, has gotten a lot of press, like you say, is these microbeads. You find microbeads, which are an ingredient in many cosmetic products, so facial scrubs, body washes, things like that. And these are very small. They're smaller than the resin pellets, and they tend to be spheres. And they found really high concentrations of these. And my guess is that they were somewhere downstream of some kind of wastewater outflow. So they are looking at that. They're the only group I know of at this point. And I think they're trying to expand their efforts to monitor in the Great Lakes. Yeah.
What can you dump when you're out at sea?
Somebody in the room can probably better answer this. I think nothing now. Is that correct, marine folks? I believe Marpole was just updated as of January of this year to say that it's food only now?
Less than an inch.
Organics only,
Uh-huh.
yeah, and only a certain distance offshore. But, you know, forever it was paper and metal and glass were okay to dump over the side, which actually, I always liked that question. You know, we would go out to sea with the students and make this big deal about plastic, and then they'd say, well, what do we do with everything else? We say, well, you dump it over the side, and there's this just look of shock. Oh my God, how can you just dump that in the ocean? But it raises a really important point. Well, where does it go on land, right? You're either burying it in a big hole, or you're burning it, or, you know, we used to just dump it in the ocean. So this is a waste management problem, and that's where the social science piece comes in. And I think that's the way that I like to think about it is, you know, we're generating a lot of stuff, and it has to go somewhere. So how do we stop making so much stuff, so much waste?
In the Gyre that you showed in the Atlantic, the cruise that you went on, I think that's pretty close to where the time series station is, isn't it? Where the Bermuda Atlantic time series is. Now, the people have been looking at things in sediment traps for a long, long time, including microscopic examination. Is there any chance you can go back through some of those collections and see over time whether there's any actual incorporation of the plastic pellets, for example, into the zooplankton, into the fecal pellets that go down into the flood?
Right. Yeah, that's an excellent suggestion. We didn't go into those records specifically, but Chris Reddy has a contact there. He spoke with Maureen Conti. And so this is somebody who's been looking at those records over many years, and she said that they have never seen reported use of plastic. And another way to look at that is the carbon and nitrogen ratios, because plastics are much different from organics. And there's no indication in those that plastics are a significant component, or a detectable component, I should say. But one thing to think about is, would you expect it to be? So in that, there's 2 things. In the subtropical gyres, even in the highest concentrations, we're talking 1 piece per cubic meter. So it's really dilute. I mean, when you think about it that way, it's quite dilute. So what are the chances that that piece is going to fall into your sediment trap, which is however big, or particle trap? The other thing that Nikolai Maximenko likes to point out is that in the subtropical convergence zone, the currents, you have a downwelling, but then they tend to go away. So it depends on where your sediment trap is. If it's below that divergent flow, subsurface divergent flow, whether it be falling directly beneath where the highest concentration is at the surface. So, but I think, I mean, the idea that this biological pump, I think, is a viable explanation for where this is ultimately ending up, why we aren't seeing it at the surface over time, like the pellet question. We just have to figure out how to get an estimate on how that might be happening.
Look, how does styrofoam fit into this?
Yeah, so
very light.
Yeah. So polystyrene, the material itself is a solid, is denser than seawater. So some of that material will sink. Most of it is foam, like we think about. That does float. That breaks down really quickly, or I should say fragments really quickly. So we don't find a whole lot of that in our net tows, but it's probably because it just never gets to the middle of the gyre before it's small enough that we don't collect it. And we do collect pieces occasionally, and you'll see like some of those large debris items that we think were tsunami debris are styrofoam that's probably flaking off as it goes. But that is a floating type of plastic that we do sometimes find. And there's no recycling stream for that. So it's even worse. Any other questions? Great, well, I invite you to take a look around SEA. We might still have some snacks, and thank you very much for coming today.